So welcome to the webinar this afternoon. I'm Andrea Perry. I am the course director, I'm the commissioning editor, commissioning and content editor of Worth Publishing and CourseWeDo. And I'll invite each of our panelists today just to briefly introduce themselves. Lucy?
Hi, I am the course director. Andrew was trying to pinch my job then. I'm the course director of CourseWeDo, so the online division of Worth Publishing.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Jackie Henry and I'm the advice and rights advocate for Croydon Drop-In.
Lovely, thank you. Jane?
Hi, I'm Jane Pickthall. I'm head of the virtual school up in North Tyneside, and I'm also a trustee on the National Association of Virtual School Heads.
Lovely, thank you. Sheila?
Hi, I'm Sheila Mulvaney. I have been a virtual head in various different local authorities, obviously been a teacher and things like that. Currently I do mostly training and a little bit of interim work, currently working with the inclusion department of a London borough.
Lovely, thank you. Colin?
I'm Colin Newton, I'm co-founder of Inclusive Solutions, an educational psychologist. Spend most of my time doing kind of training and person-centered planning around the UK. Passionate about inclusion. What does it take for us all to get along?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. You know, the power of this and the power of what is actually going on when a child or a young person is excluded, what they get to carry on behalf of whom they get to carry it. These are obviously something of massive import for everybody, most especially them, but for all the circles around them. So we hope that today will be a way to just help us all to reflect on this and to, from an attachment to a trauma-informed perspective, just get perhaps some new thoughts, some new ideas, affirm some of the great stuff you're doing already to support you, to support them to be included better together. So what I would like to do now is to hand over to Colin.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having the energy to be here with us on a Friday. This is absolutely fantastic. I'm absolutely passionate around what does it take to reduce these awful exclusion figures that we have, that we're so dominated by in this country, and anything that can promote inclusion, anything that's kind of relational, kind of helps us in this area. I'm sure of that. Anything that involves kind of person-centered working, inclusive approaches, anything that involves circles often seems to work. But rising through the heart of this is an approach called restorative justice, which I in Nottingham, as the principal educational psychologist over 20 years ago, learned from the Nottinghamshire police, bizarrely. I mean, how bizarre is that I would learn an approach like this, which is so psychological, from the police, but that's how it was. That's how it was. And they were sick of all the permanent exclusions taking place in Nottinghamshire, all these young people ending up out on the streets. And they themselves were using these approaches, and they'd learned this approach interestingly, from the Thames Valley Police, who had learned this approach from the Australian police, who'd learned their approach from the New Zealand police, who'd learned it from the Maori. So isn't that interesting what roots we've come? And now it's much more spoken of now. So I pitched this off Love Actually, because there's this lovely bit at the end of the film where everyone kind of comes together in these wonderful hugs. And right now, don't you just wish there was a lot more people you could hug in the world? It's just a real reminder of relationship. And restorative justice kind of trades on the space between people without being too zen about it. It literally, the relationship space, that is the important space. And we're kind of right now in this lockdown, we're thinking a lot about space, aren't we? Space between people. But in restorative terms, we're looking at when harm gets caused, what can we do to restore the harm, to restore the relationship, knowing it won't just be between two people that the harm gets caused. There's always ripples, isn't there? In a school culture, those ripples can impact on friendships, and even wider on all the young people and the adults who get affected when harm gets caused. So that's kind of what we want to get into. So I thought I'd maybe just start off by considering what actually makes something that we would term restorative justice. So a restorative justice process must offer a way forward. It should offer a way of putting things right or making things right between the parties involved where the harm has taken place. It should be something we can all live with, and And that's quite important in this, really. So it can't just be the sorry, it's got to be maybe more than that. It's got to allow things to move forward and able to put things right. But all the parties need to be able to live with what we've come up with. As I say, it's got to be more than an apology. We can kind of, any experienced educator can squeeze an apology out of most children and young people. But those kind of real forced, sorry, where they don't really mean it. We've just kind of squeezed it out of them, and it's not heartfelt at all. So it has to be more than that. So if the child thinks they kind of see you coming with your restorative processes and quickly get in with a, yeah, sorry, I'm sorry. The follow-up question is always, what else can you do? What else can you bring? What else can you do? And there's something else we can all live with. I always remember we've got some special needs coordinators with us today. I remember one in a secondary school. His desk had been wrecked by this young man who'd really got angry, lost it, wrecked the special needs coordinator's office. And some would say he's lucky to have an office, but anyway, he wrecked it. When we were doing something restorative, the Senko said, what really I could do with is my bin being replaced. I bought that out of my own money from IKEA. I want this bin replaced. For him, that's what it took. The apologies were fine, having the room tidied up was fine, but this thing he bought was so kind of important to him. So restorative justice, these are sort of the essential elements. So what I thought we'd do now is take a look at a little video that kind of brings it to life a little bit, and then I'll talk a bit more about it.
Sir, I'm really sorry it's late, but I've managed to complete the homework for you.
Late again, Matthew?
What do you mean?
Well, it's a regular occurrence. It happens quite often, actually. You always have an excuse.
Oh, I tell you what, just leave it then!
Wait, stop!
When people behave like this, how do we respond?
Whoa! What do you think you are doing?
By shouting them down? Giving the message that the one with the loudest voice comes out on top? Or by punishing them? Or by concentrating solely on what has happened and ignoring the reasons why it has happened? Or is there a better way? One which doesn't merely ask who is to blame and what should the punishment be, but one which explores causes, feelings, effects. One which asks rather different questions, such as what happened? Who has been affected? What harm has been caused? And crucially, how can we put things right? One that involves listening, not telling. A way that is better, not just for those who have been harmed, but also for those who have caused harm.
I can get my point of view across without being in an argument.
We all understood how we all felt.
And which aims to stop it happening again. A way that means a line can be drawn under the incident and everyone can move on.
It's enabled us for staff, I think, to feel heard and to actually feel that problems are resolved rather than just punished.
A way that works.
It's much more positive.
It isn't seen as a soft option. It's actually seen as something that is successful and it will help us all.
Some of the ideas behind a restorative approach have been around for some years. For example, reconciliation between offenders and victims was first tried in Canada back in 1975. This approach proved to be so successful that it led to other victim-offender projects in Canada and the United States. And in the next few years, victim-offender mediation was tried in some European countries with encouraging results. Another element of a restorative approach is restorative conferencing, bringing together those directly involved in an incident with people who've been affected by it, in the company of their family members or people from the community. This approach has its roots in New Zealand. Maoris believe that when someone commits an offence, it impacts on the family and the wider community. They also believe that the whole community must be accountable for what has happened and be involved in finding a way forward. Since then, many schools throughout the country, infant, primary, secondary, special schools and pupil referral units, have benefited from adopting a restorative approach.
When I read the material about restorative approaches, I realised that it was something that really fitted with my own personal ethos and my beliefs. And I knew through my own experiences of conflict and resolving problems in my own life that it was certainly something that I could see would really empower children and staff. Over the years, we've then trained every year, we've trained at least 3 members of staff, and we're very blessed that those staff have stayed at the school, and so those experiences are shared through inset, through day-to-day experience. You think it's going to be time consuming, but actually the time consuming side of things was in the past was the more negative approaches to managing conflict or exclusions or detentions. They take up far much more time than actually taking the time to resolve a problem. It's meant that we've been able to free up people's time to concentrate on learning. My school is in a very challenging setting. There are children with a high percentage of children with special needs, children with difficulties with managing their behaviour, and despite the challenges we may have faced implementing it, without a doubt you can see the difference it's made to the community.
It's well, so much to say about it really, but for me it's a wonderful alternative to fixed term and even permanent exclusions. It could be used instead of fixed term exclusions quite easily as a kind of, as long as it's taken seriously, and by involving more people, more players, it can also be an alternative to a permanent exclusion, and some schools have really embraced this. Where it works best, of course, the school takes it on systemically, all the staff are trained in the approach, everybody's on board with it. Other schools are just kind of pockets of practice. And I guess that's reflected nationally. You know, there's some local authorities have really embraced this way of working. Some schools have really embraced this way of working. Others haven't. Others have heard about it. Maybe maybe use it just sometimes really, in terms of individual practitioner activity. There's often people, if you talk to parents about this, they'll say something's got to be done about what happened there. This incident's happened. That harm that was caused was so bad, something must happen. Something's got to be done about it. You know that voice? That's a very strong voice, usually seeking out retribution. And I think, unfortunately, our society is haunted by these very old-fashioned eye for an eye kind of approaches to retribution, to putting things right. And this is kind of really trying to change that juggernaut of thinking around to a different way of thinking, to say, well, we're working here with children and young people, they're learning. Just like they're learning maths or anything else, they need to learn a different way of doing things, a different way of being. This is a way of teaching them a different way of being by thinking how it affects other people. And by sitting with the discomfort of listening to how other people have been made to feel and what they ended up doing. So it's trying to get into this. So the new thing we are doing at this school or in this local authority, whatever, is we're having a restorative justice conference. Or in the corridor situation in the school, the teacher, the teaching assistant is using a restorative exchange, a restorative script to kind of just figure things out, maybe between a smaller group as just 2 young people caught in a conflict with each other. The key questions are always, what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What were you feeling at the time? What have you been thinking since it happened? What have you been feeling since it happened? And how can you put it right? And who's been affected by what you've done? And now what can you do to make it right? That's the key script. Any of you listening to me now could take this away and try it on in your family home tonight. I've got 3 children, brought up, and they, I used it a lot, I have to say, when things got really bad. And
2 minutes, Colin, if that's okay. 2 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. To the point they would kind of see me coming, so not that restorative thing again, but you would try and sneak up on them with it. But then I said, well, would you rather I punished you? Oh no, go on then, let's talk about it. So interesting. So it really has a lot of promise. My wife is a head teacher of a large primary school in Nottingham, 600 young people there. She uses it all the time. All the staff are trained in it. The midday supervisors, the teaching assistants, everybody is totally signed up to it. She's done 2 fixed term exclusions in 6 years. I think that says all, don't you? That's inner city Nottingham. There's done a lot of very challenging stuff going on there. So I would strongly recommend it. Yeah, so just to say, I've co-written a book about this, so no wonder I'm so positive about it. But it was purely because I was inspired by the work going on in Nottingham and elsewhere that I saw, simply called Restorative Solutions, Making It Work. We were the distributor of a lovely video created in Milton Keynes by the psychologist there about introducing restorative justice, very practical step by step. So we've got that video. So that's, you can get that kind of package from us, which some people find quite useful to get them kind of going from scratch on it. So there's a lot to be learned. So it's, as I say, it can be taught systemically. Training kind of goes really well with it. It's eminently learnable. It can be done in quite a short time. People can get the basic scripts to something where you really, really try and embed it across the school in a repeated way. We've also created an online school. I don't know if Lucy, you could share that on the chat and the reference for the online school, but we've got a number of courses up there, self-paced kind of learning, and one of them we've got on restorative justice. So get that off the chat perhaps. And then the last slide, I think, and that was just to encourage you to stay in touch, because that was just a 10-minute burst on restorative justice, which I have to say, I do think we need something radical in our tackling of exclusions. And for my money, it's restorative justice. Thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Colin. It's just really, really interesting. And you were quite right at the beginning. You said you could talk about this for a long time. And I thought, well, I could listen to this for a long time. We only have a short amount of time, I'm afraid, and obviously 2 more presentations. So I will just go to Sheila briefly for one moment. Perhaps you'd just like to respond, Sheila, just in, again, a couple of lines. One of the things that I noticed when Colin was talking about the impact, the ripples of impact. Could you come off mute? Thank you. The ripples of impact of an exclusion in your experience. Would you just like to comment on that? Because I'm sure that's very right in terms of, you know, we don't know what we're excluding children to, or we're excluding people to. So perhaps if you could comment on that.
Yes, I think there's kind of a couple of aspects. The first is a very, I want to say, straightforward safeguarding issue. You know, I mean, we've certainly seen, we know there are links between things like exclusions and children, particularly older children, where they might be excluded at home, but it might be that their parents are working. It's very hard to make sure they stay at home, obviously not in this current sort of scenario. And we know that, you know, that has often meant that they are involving themselves in gangs, in stuff that goes on. So I think there is definitely a safeguarding issue. And I feel like schools need to, well, I think it's a kind of a moral thing, isn't it? You know, I don't know how a head teacher morally can exclude a student if they feel they cannot be 100% sure that they're safe. So for me, that's a biggie. The other biggie is, I think, when we're talking about children who are vulnerable, so children who maybe have been looked after, or children need, or are vulnerable and not even recognised necessarily by our statutory services, some of them will have experienced adversity and trauma and attachment, and an exclusion, without any doubt in my mind, is a trauma. You know, we say to children, go away, do not come back. Certainly a permanent exclusion. I mean, I think a fixed term exclusion can be as well, but certainly with a permanent exclusion, it is a go away, you are not allowed back. I mean, that is the ultimate rejection for a child. And I think, you know, I know teachers don't take the Hippocratic oath or anything like that, but I feel like, you know, at a basic level, we shouldn't be doing harm. Yeah. And I feel like exclusion does harm. And I think we've got to find alternatives around it, and other countries, to be fair, do. You know, it's not every country that does exclude in the way we do, and yet I think unfortunately the current context is government to kind of back that as an approach to get kids out of the way, to concentrate on the other kids who generally are the kids that have all the advantages anyway. That's obviously a bit of a general approach, but you know, and it's absolutely appropriate sometimes that children are got out of the classroom so others can learn. But that whole kind of, you shall go away and you shall never come back, how major is that in a young child's life? Yeah,
lovely.
Even
Thank you very much.
Scotland's not very far away, is it? They don't have the exclusion process that we have in England. And
sorry, where was that?
Scotland.
Oh, right, yes. Oh, absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
They're not using it.
Interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Sheila, for a bit of commentary there. That's great. Colin, thank you so much for being with us. It's really, really appreciated. I also love the fact that the model has got these international roots, because we can really learn from what is happening in other cultures, even if the culture is just up the road in Scotland. But it would be really, it's so good that draws. I didn't know about the Maori roots of that, but that's really fantastic to look at what is happening elsewhere. Yes, terrific. And things like the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, it all draws on the same kind of nonviolent principles, doesn't it? It's like, let's have everybody in, and the Joe Cox principle is much more in common. Yeah.
And if I'd had time, there's the international research around the impact of restorative justice in schools, especially work done in Canada. Scotland have done a lot of research on it as well, and the Youth Justice Board in the UK,
indeed.
Of course, have done it.
Wonderful.
Incredibly.
We've got someone from Scotland. Hello, good. Okay,
And
thank you so much, Colin. That's great. We'll need to move on now, but thank you so much for your time. Much, much appreciated.
thank you, and lovely to meet you all. Sorry, I got to leave. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye. Take care. Thank
Take care.
you. So, Jane, can I hand over to you?
It's interesting that we've done a lot of restorative justice work in North Tyneside. I sit on the Youth Justice Board as well, and some of our teachers in schools actually have it on their lanyard, those 5 questions. It's just a constant reminder that there are, there is other ways to approach it. So yeah, that was really nice to hear that. Right, so here's some data. I think it's really important to there's a national picture at the top there for the, obviously attendance data tends to be a bit of a lag, as you'll be aware. But at the moment, the last data that we've got, the permanent exclusion rate was 0.10, but that amounts to the total number of permanent exclusions, nearly 8,000 children. So we're talking about a lot of children permanently excluded from schools. That's actually stayed static, I think, over the last year. Fixed term exclusions, much higher rate there, 5.36. The number of children there, you're looking at over 438,000 children. Think how much education's being missed. We know there's a massive attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils and other pupils. And when you think about the amount of learning that gets lost if a child is excluded, there's a real case not to do it as well, let alone what it does to a child. There's also data here, obviously the focus of my role is predominantly around looked after children, previously looked after children, and there's certainly talk in the DfE at the moment around children in need. And this is one of the drivers for that. There was a big children in need review a couple of years ago. And what they found was, this picture around permanent exclusions. You can see since virtual school heads became statutory 2015, the green line is looked after children. I know it's quite faint, some of the writing on this, but the green line is looked after children. And you can see that we've had a real impact in terms of permanent exclusion. North Tyneside have had 1 permanent exclusion in 17 years. So, we've done a really good job there. But when you look at children in need, the number of them that are getting permanently excluded is really high. And we know that their experiences, their home situations are often what we all know what they've been through. So to see that very high number is worrying. Fixed term exclusions, however, we're less proud of. So looked after children, although they're not being permanently excluded, they are the highest group for fixed term exclusions. So that's something that we've done a lot to address nationally and certainly in North Tyneside, because we know that, again, it's about mislearning, it's about rejection, it's putting pressure on placements at home, foster placements, that whole safeguarding issue that Sheila mentioned then. So we're really keen, this is a serious issue for virtual schools and for everybody around exclusion. So it's also really useful, I think, to have a look at the reasons why children are being excluded. I put a link on the previous slide. The DfE has some fantastic data and you can play with it and manipulate it to your heart's content. If you're a data geek like me, follow the link and have fun. But you can have a look at all the different reasons why children are excluded. And I think when we're thinking about trauma and attachment, this is really important. So we can see there the most, and this is for permanent exclusion as well, actually, persistent disruptive behaviour is the most common reason why children are excluded, followed by a mysterious other, and then that verbal abuse against an adult and physical assault against a pupil.
Sorry, I'm trying. Don't worry, speak and it will get there.
So I think what I'm going to be thinking about linking this in terms of trauma and attachment related behaviours. So as you can see, if you think about disruptive behaviour, physical assault and verbal abuse, we know that sort of a lot of those trauma behaviours in the survival brain, if a child is feeling sort of a high level of stress, or they're feeling that they're under attack, they're more likely to go into that fight, flight or freeze response. And I think some of these behaviours that are leading to exclusion may be linked to that. We also know that there's possibly something that happened prior. And I think we're always really curious about what that antecedent was, what might have happened before the behaviour that led to an exclusion. We know that a child who was shouted at, it was really useful, that film that Colin just showed, because I think, look, that links in really nicely. So we know that, you know, if an adult shouts at a child, and if a child has grown up in an environment where there's been a lot of domestic abuse, there's been domestic violence, shouting can really trigger, you know, and I've had many children actually express that to me before. And yet look at the numbers there in terms of individuals. 650 pupils were permanently excluded for verbally abusing an adult. Over 67,000 pupils had a fixed term exclusion for that verbally responding to an adult. And we know from our experience of working with traumatized children that it's very rare for it to come out of nowhere. So you just, you know, you've always got to be thinking about where that was coming from, and those restorative questions around what a child was feeling at the time. Chances are they were feeling incredibly vulnerable, incredibly stressed, very frightened possibly, and that, you know, quite quickly things can escalate for our children. So it might simply have been that they, you know, they dropped a pencil or they broke a pencil or something happened very minor, but then the adult will respond to that. And then the child obviously has that, what we talk about, these shame responses, a lot of our children, or they'll go into that fight, flight, freeze response because they feel that they're being attacked, because they're being put on the spotlight. They don't want that. So actually that's when it then may escalate, or as we know, you know, that thing about shouting, in that video we saw there were lots of examples of adults shouting at children in a corridor, and you know, that whole experience and what that does to children. And so we've been trying to encourage our schools to have no shouting policies, and one of our high schools has got that in place. And it's just so lovely to read, because it's about how the adult behaviour influences and can impact on the child's behaviour. And I think that's something that we need to be much more aware of in schools, and be thinking more about how the adult behaviour impacts on child behaviour, because that persistently disruptive behaviour, we know from our trauma and attachment work, you know, some of these sort of ladder of consequences approaches just don't work. So that taking a more trauma informed approach is really important. So the next slide then is, I just wanted to mention a bit about the work that's been going on in North Tyneside, because I'm really proud of our head teachers and their approach that they've been taking. So you'll see there our rates against the national rates. So we're lower in terms of permanent exclusions. We're significantly lower in terms of the fixed term exclusions as well. And this is partly because our Children and Young People's Plan, one of our pledges has been keeping children in schools. So we've taken this on as a whole local authority. There's very much an approach that these are our children. So, you know, even though children are in different schools, within different families, we very much see them in terms of them being all of our children, and we all have a responsibility in terms of making sure that they have the most positive experience at school and at home, and they're cared for, and they're recognised that we all have a responsibility to them. And this idea of keeping children in schools, what happened was although our exclusion rates were very low, we were seeing quite a lot of managed moves going on. You may have heard of these, and there's very much a view that a managed move is sort of a permanent exclusion in disguise. So we started unpicking it a bit more and looking at how many of them were successful, how many of them were failing. We actually found that a lot of them weren't working. So children were having these short-term fresh starts. We also know that for a lot of our children who have had experienced trauma, fresh starts are the last thing they need. They need that long time they need to build trust with adults, build those relationships, feel safe at school. So for looked after children, we've always said we don't do managed moves, we won't do short-term solutions, but for those children who weren't looked after, this was still happening. And so what happened was the head teacher sort of took this on board and recognised it, and they decided that they needed to be a bit more responsible around that decision making. So our fair access panel had become a bit of a tick box exercise, and I'm sure they would agree with that. And what they decided was it was really important to get back round the table and to face to face and make sure that they were holding each other to account and making sure that everything that could be done was being done for those children. So they would check that support had been put in place, that any additional funding, that there'd been an EP assessment, that, you know, that those conversations, that there was a really good understanding about why it had reached this point with this child where they felt they'd reached the end of the road. And it's only at that point would they then consider thinking about moving a child to another provision, and whether that was something more specialist, whether that was into our alternative provision, or whether that was to another school. It meant that those decisions were being made having had those conversations and that challenge. We've also got a fantastic team that work to support schools and have those conversations with families and with the school and make sure that the move is in the right interest of the child. There's been another strand of that work looking at behaviour policies, because we knew that some of them were that ladder of consequence and things were escalating too quickly, and so our schools had a review of their behaviour policies. We've started introducing relationship policies back to, you know, thinking about how the behaviour of an adult can impact and how those relationships need to be central to the work we're doing. Encouraging the no shouting policies that I just talked about. We've had Thrive training across our schools. We've got our educational psychology service are now trained to deliver Thrive, so they're now trainers, which meant we could, our learning trust in the authority, we're offering a buy one get one free offer to encourage people to take that up. So that's been rolled out, and we've just got some funding from our Bernardo's partnership, so our high schools can have it as well. So we're making sure that people are aware of attachment and trauma. It's a 10-day training program on attachment and trauma. Comes with a tool to help school staff understand where a child's at emotionally, and I think them looking at children through different eyes and recognising that the expectations around what a child could and couldn't do given their emotional development was much better understood. And we've just started a rollout of mental health first aid and making sure that the confidence around supporting children's mental health and understanding around behaviour was really clear. So in terms, you know, that whole sort of that moral leadership that Sheila was mentioning before, that ethical sort of decision making is really at the core, I think, of the approach in North Tyneside that's making a real difference. And then there's my team, so the virtual schools sit within the Hive team, which is a multi-agency team. So it means that we're able, particularly for those children who are care experienced, looked after, previously looked after, we've got a model there that can, with a multi-agency team that can offer more support to schools, but also to children and their families. So if you just pop on to the next slide, I'll just briefly, we use the neurosequential model in our team. It's really helpful for people to understand that sort of we take this approach, which is very much based on sort of brain development, child development. So we would start with a sensory safety approach and making sure children were feeling safe, that they weren't in that survival zone all the time where they were going into that fight, flight, freeze response. So it's very much about enhancing safety, and some of the approaches we would use there with our occupational therapists would be some sensory attachment work. We're training foster carers around therapeutic parenting. We use TheraPlay both at home and in school. There's some programs we've developed ourselves there as well. And then we go into the emotional, the limbic brain, which is much more around attachment and relationships. And again, we'll work with school staff. We provide support for support staff in school, supervision for them. We will build on those attachment again using some of those approaches, including Team Pupil, Louise Bomber's approach, books available on the Worth Publishing website. We use video interaction guidance, so we work at supporting relationships. We've got dyadic developmental psychotherapy, we use states continuum work, so we really do a lot to sort of understand what's going on for the children. And then that third foundation, which is the neocortex, and that very much more logical thinking and learning, where you can actually start to really process what's going on for a child, and that's through sort of our counselling offer as well. So to put it briefly and to round it off nicely, hopefully within time, the last slide.
Good, well done, Jane. If I can get this, there you go.
It's obviously sort of, with, you know, Bruce Perry is sort of behind the neurosequential model, and he would very simply sort of remind us, and this is something that I think schools really need to understand, is first point is regulation, then it's the relationship, and then the reasoning. So I think very often schools will go in at a reasoning level, expecting a child who's in a very dysregulated state to be able to explain why they've just done what they've done. And actually what we need to do is recognise that there's a time and a place. A child needs some time to come out of that zone. They need to be with somebody that they feel safe, and then you're going to be able to do that reasoning and understand what's happened and be able to move on from that. There we go. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Full steam ahead there, Jane. I'm so sorry to cut you off. There's just so much interesting material. I think I'm going to ask Jackie to speak in a moment, and then Sheila, come back to you if I might, to kind of make some links between the two. But just so much rich stuff there, and there's a couple of questions here about collecting any data from the students about their experience of these initiatives, and that might be something you'd like to speak about in a bit, Jane, because it would be really helpful to know. But yes, such a rich plethora, and it seems to me that you're approaching it from so many different angles simultaneously, and always grounded in that completely physiological human approach of the centrality of relationships and the centrality of knowing what is it to actually be with another human being in a space where things are going wrong, what the basis of that is, and all the environmental factors around that, and all the people around that. It goes back to what Colin was saying about the ripples, doesn't it? The ripples from something that is going wrong somewhere. It's a systemic approach. It's not just about, oh, this child's done something wrong, therefore it's bad. Boom. There's just so much more to it when we unpack it. Thank you so much. Could I ask you to mute yourself, and Jackie, could you unmute yourself? And so Jackie's going to talk to us about advocacy on behalf of the young people with whom you work. And perhaps you'd just like to say a line about Croydon Drop-In per se, just to give us the context.
Yes, I will. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Croydon Drop-In has been around in Croydon for 42 years. It's a fairly largish team made up of counsellors. There's me as an advice and rights advocate, and there's only one. We have our outreach team. We also have a 0 to 2 service called PIP, Parent in Partnership, and they work with newborns, parents who are pregnant and having their first child or second child, and sort of bonding with the baby. And then we have little elements that are attached to us but work with us, which is our young people's team. We have a series of young people's teams who help out with drop-in and going forth with that. And that's it, I think, really. We're small, but we're large in the same way.
A lot of influence,
yeah,
in the bar. Yeah. Great, thank you. So yes, right. Do talk to us about your work. That would be great.
So what my role is the advice and rights advocate for Croydon Drop-In. And as I said, I'm one worker. I do have someone who's working alongside me at the moment. That's been fairly recent. But my role picks up where counselling stops, and we'll provide support, advice, and getting things done, for instance, and that would be for young people and parents alike. So it would be some things along the line of form filling, writing letters, speaking on someone's behalf. The list can be endless, and it just depends where that parent or young person is at that time. So needless to say, for me, no 2 days are ever the same. So I think the colleagues on the panel covered an awful lot of information for which I'm really grateful that that's out there. So thank you for that. So it makes my job easier in actually what I'm going to talk about. So we're talking about school exclusions. So usually when parents arrive at CDI, having gone down a number of routes before getting to me or our service, or finding that they're unable to handle the situation within school. So when speaking to the parent or even the young person, should they come and tell us about what's happening, I always say to them that communication is key in every way possible. So, and also to look at challenging behavior, which is something that we've mentioned here today as well, for that young person or whoever's caused that around that young person, because that young person could have got involved in a different way and then been the blame or the butt of everything. So, and also look at whether behavior, is it related to health in some way? So we need to sort of really check that out, because some people really don't have the idea of that it could be. And are there problems being experienced both at home and at school or at school? So as an example, some parents are upset by the way they're being treated or their young person has been treated within the school system. That's something that we mentioned today. And during this time, and in many respects, the young person is left in limbo. This can be quite daunting for them, dealing with their own emotions, both at home and at school, waiting for an outcome, which could result in either being managed move, excluded for a few days, weeks, or even permanently. So the case being, this being the case, will put the young person and the family having to look for a new school and tackle being put on a waiting list, because a lot of schools have waiting lists now, or out of school completely. So there's a lot of things going on around that for that family and their school life. The role can be quite challenging, as there are a lot of emotions and anxiety being played out, not only by the parent, but also by the young person as well. One meeting I remember working with a parent and her daughter who attended a local secondary school. The daughter was exceptionally tall for her age and felt picked on by the teachers at school. A meeting was arranged where the parent and the daughter had attended. And at the meeting, I was able to make a suggestion going forward so that the young person could be rewarded rather than sort of stigmatized all the time with what's been going on at school and picked on and everything like that, which is what was going on for her. Needless to say that the school adapted this and made it something that they could own and work with for future, so that person could move forward with attending the school. So in attending these meetings, I always try to ensure that the young person's voice is heard. I think it's an important aspect that we have to have here, because without their voice being heard, all these regulations and everything that's in place, they have no idea how to deal with that. And if the parent have no idea on how to deal with that, then who would deal with that? So everything's in limbo. So at another meeting, I worked with a parent, again, a daughter who I had not met until I arrived at the school. Conversations obviously were carried out over the phone prior to that appointment. But on top of that meeting, the school had arranged quite quickly a meeting during the day. So the issues for the school were listed by the head of year at that meeting. The parent, although very nervous, made it known that she had her say at the issues, because she felt quite empowered having someone there to sort of support her and talk to as well, and really stipulated what she wanted for her daughter. I actually suggested at the meeting, could all of what the school have agreed be put in writing so that the parent could have that? with her, and the head agreed and followed up that evening with the information that they had stipulated in the meeting. They're just two meetings out of the many that I've attended, and obviously had different outcomes. But I really wanted to just stop now and say that I've got 3 tips for parents or foster carers, or everyone really, because when it comes down to exclusions, like Jane was saying, schools have their own regulations that they're actually working to. But my tip would be that parents and carers need to be aware and use the school's policies. Schools have policies which cover a lot of what's going on daily within the school setting, and these are available on their websites. The second tip is for parents, foster carers, etc. If they have to attend a meeting, try to take someone with you, because someone that can take notes, because these meetings can be very scary or intimidating, and you're thinking maybe all over the place. So it would be good to have someone there with you. And thirdly, if agreements have been made or are being made at the meeting, get confirmation of it in writing. An email will do, so long as it's from the school. So before I leave now, I just wanted to say that there is a good service in London. Sorry for everyone who's outside of London. I'm not sure if they have extended, but it's called Communities Empowerment Network, and which is an education charity that supports children, young people, parents and families through difficulties they may have at the at schools. So I just wanted to sort of leave you with that, and thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Jackie, very much. Again, it's just so interesting, and there could be there's so many questions I'm sure that people would have for you in that work, because I don't think that necessarily everyone has such a service as that. And Sheila, I don't know if you'd like to comment really on, what that might be like for parents to have Jackie alongside in terms of your experience.
Yes, I mean, I think very often parents feel very threatened by schools. It's easy for us not to appreciate that when we're professionals that work with schools a lot, but actually my experience of both parents and foster carers is they often feel quite threatened and anxious around schools because they're quite formal places, and without someone to support them, I think it's incredibly daunting. Just listening to those examples, Jackie, that you gave was wonderful, because it just feels like actually if you hadn't been there, those outcomes would have been very, very different, I think. Yeah, I think just absolutely brilliant work, and I think your tips were perfect. It's always good to have a supporter there, because going into reintegration meetings sometimes, or certainly given as disciplinary, there can be a whole table full of people all dressed quite smartly, all feeling terribly formal. So yeah, a very, very difficult, I think, for parents. And as parents, we hate it when our children are criticised. It's all right if we do it, but actually hearing, and often they feel blamed, they feel got at. So a brilliant, brilliant service, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. And Jane, if you because you've only literally got 30 seconds, Jane, to make one comment, please, on what would you say? Because I'm really aware that what we're talking about now is the ripples around, isn't it? It's the community around these children and young people. And I love that line from Colin where he was saying, in the Maori way of thinking, then the whole community is responsible if a child is displaying challenging behaviour. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it, really? Or if there's a misdemeanour, it's a community issue. What would be your one top tip for supporting staff in the way that Jackie has been talking about supporting parents? What's your one top tip for supporting your staff?
Oh my God. Staff in schools, would that be? Are you talking about?
Yes, when things are very escalated and they've got to do all the containing, they've got to do things calm, just like so. Then
yeah, I think it's not take it personally is a massive one, because I think it can be very emotional, and it can feel, particularly when a child is in that awful dysregulated state, it can feel that I haven't done something right, or I'm not in charge here. And I think that's why it's so important why we do all the stuff around sort of what's going on in the body, psychoeducation, and what a child's experienced, to help take away some of that and just provide that support so that they can, they have that opportunity not to you know, it's not anybody's fault. You know, it's a set of circumstances that we're there to sort of support and be that bridge, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think the other thing that's been great here also is that when we've started with Colin drawing these models from around the world and looking at whole school, and then we've come through the heart of the school with Jane's presentation and Sheila annotating this, but also then to Jackie, because Jackie is positioned in the community. Croydon Drop-In is commissioned in the community, isn't it, Jackie? But kind of doing that enfolding process, I sort of feel like my arms around the screen here. But in terms of the Russian doll approach, you know, that there are circles within circles, aren't we? And just to take the challenging behaviours, this is something that's saying something just about the child is such a blinkered view, really. And if we can only see it as this involves all of us. And I can't thank the four of you, and I'm sorry Colin's not here to say that, for your contributions today. Thank you so much, because it's just, there is so much to be said about this, and I think the work you're all doing is terrific. So thank you so much. We couldn't thank you enough, people who are watching, for being here, because we know you've had probably a really, really tough week. You've spent your time really on the front line supporting children and young people and each other, we hope, and then you're coming in here to be giving us your time as well to tap into some further thinking about exclusion. Thank you so much for being here, and please take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.